Today, are smart meters making us miserable? After the tragic death of a dog walker, are new laws needed? And Prime Minister's questions live at noon. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Alex Shelbrooke, Labour MP Barry Gardiner, political strategist Jo Tanner and host of the Westminster Insider podcast, Alva Ray. On today's programme.
So it's time to power up the future. Storing renewable electricity and batteries that will help change the world.
British Volt, an electric car battery company, has gone bust. Should the government have saved it?
This is a tragic incident where a young woman has sadly lost her life, and our thoughts are with her family and friends.
After the death of a dog walker at the weekend, is regulation needed to police the growing number of dogs in the UK?
A man dressed as a woman walked into the toilets. I was on my own in the toilets. He stood behind me and stared at me into the mirror, looking at me in my eyes.
The idea of linking trans people with predators, frankly, is disgusting, and you should be ashamed.
Passions run high as MPs debate whether to block Scotland's gender recognition bill.
We have extended an olive branch, in fact the whole tree, to government. We've said meet us halfway, so now come on, let's get round the table and let's stop the strikes.
Nurses go on strike again and teachers prepared to take to the picket line next month. Will strikes dominate debate at Prime Minister's questions again? We'll bring you that live at noon. Let's start with inflation. The latest figure for December, it's dipped slightly, but it's still at a record high of 10.5%, with cost of living pressures, of course, continuing to bite. Much of the increased costs on households going on higher energy bills. And at the moment, of course, we are living through a cold snap, as you can see here from this weather map. Temperatures dipping far colder, actually, than expected, -7 and -6. Now, for people with smart meters in their homes, they can constantly monitor, as we can show you, the amount they're spending on their heating, literally minute by minute. And the question is it leading to heightened anxiety? Are they making us miserable, these smart meters, Jo?
Well, they've caused some problems in my house. I've got a disabled mother who's in a wheelchair, and we moved the smart meter because of a renovation we had indoors. And I came in one day and thought, it's really chilly in here. And I have the heating on all day because she needs it. She's in a wheelchair, so moving around, you just don't get warm in the same way, and you can't get warm in the same way. And I said, what's happening? Is something wrong with the boiler? And her face was, well, no, have you seen what's happened? Like, look at the price on the meter. And I thought, my gosh, I just hadn't thought of it. And I could afford to pay for the heating. And I hadn't thought
she'd switched.
She literally turned down the thermostat. And so I really thought, my goodness, I had no idea. And you know, I am in a position that I can pay for the heat. It is a lot, but I can pay for it. But that was in a house where my mum, you know, knew we had the money and but we just couldn't get her head around the fact that this was
going up and up
so much. She said it was like a one-armed bandit.
Goodness
the way
me.
she described it.
What's your experience? Because you've got a smart meter.
I do. And look, I think it shows that they work because it does make us conscious of just how much energy we're using. And I know I got one probably about half a year ago, or maybe a bit longer. And I did start, you know, making sure that I went round and switched the lights off after my son, and you know, it did change my habits. But I think what we're all waiting for is the really smart meters. In fact, these meters are pretty dumb. All they do is they show you how much you're using and how much it's costing. Whereas the next generation, we keep on being promised, will be the ones that are able to integrate with all your, you know, your washing machine and your fridge and your freezer, and actually begin to switch you on at the right times when it's cheapest and switch you off when it's not.
And if they could have a cattle prod through the phone that then tells your teenage son to switch off the light or something, that'd be even better.
That's the one I want.
Please give us all your domestic issues here on Politics Live. I mean, do you think it's making people really worried and possibly a bit down when they see the sort of pound sign literally going up in terms of how much you're having to spend?
Well, there'll probably be some of that, but I don't think it's smart meters per se that are worrying people. People know that the cost of energy is enormous, and you know, within our household, a bit like Jo, you know, we have the heat on a lot. This year we haven't. Now, I haven't got a smart meter. Well, I did have a smart meter, and then I switched supplier, and now that one doesn't work.
I see, it's not, it's broken.
So it's there, and I can't be bothered to have them all round again, switching everything off, replacing it. But we know energy is expensive, and so you're just making those conscious efforts anyway. And I think that people are generally, it's probably one of the biggest worries is paying energy bills. And so I don't necessarily think it's down to a smart meter that's worrying people. It's that everybody's well aware of just how expensive energy is.
Alva?
Well, exactly. I think it's the cost of energy rather than being able to see it notching up and up. As someone who doesn't have a smart meter, I think it's almost just as bad, even if you can't monitor it, wondering how much all that's costing, and then occasionally sending a meter reading and then sort of being lumped with this huge energy bill, which kind of comes in the abstract and is often kind of just estimated and varies month to month. I think, you know, that's in a way just as bad. I think it's all very sad that I mean, in lots of cases, it's just making people more aware of their energy usage. This conversation kind of stemmed from a slightly funny Spectator Living article with this woman in a 5-bedroom, 4-bathroom loft barn conversion who's talking about her smart meter stress. But I think at the hard edge of it, these people are talking about making a choice between heating their homes or food.
But sorry,
I think
that makes a really important point, because it's saying, well, you've got a big expensive house, why are you worrying about your energy bill? But it's a percentage increase. It's tripled from what it was. So you live within your budget. That has now tripled on those energy bills. So it's slightly, it's irrelevant to say the size, because people have to heat that. They made decisions when they did it, and their energy bills increased. So the worry of energy goes across the board.
Well, that brings us to this, and perhaps you could comment, Barry, in the eye. Stop forcing families onto prepayment or prepay meters, warns the Business Secretary, Grant Shapps. Do you agree with him?
Yes, I do. You know, prepayment meters, inevitably, it's the poorest people that are pushed onto.
And they've got a slightly higher standing charge as well.
And I think, you know, Alva's made the point very, very well, that it is the poor that are suffering most here. Yes, nobody likes to see their costs, their energy costs or any other costs increase in the way that they have. But the fact is that it's the poorest that are paying the price here, and they're not getting the return from government. And you simply have to wonder, why is it that actually the windfall tax on the energy companies is not being given to us, this relief.
Well, Barry, hang on a minute. £39 billion pounds.
Sorry, look,
and I'll come to you. We'll let Barry finish, and I'll come to you, Alex.
The point I wanted to make is this, that what the government is doing at the moment is it's loaning us this money, and we will have to pay it back in higher charges in the future. That's
over a long period of time.
Yeah. And the second point is that actually the subsidies that they're giving to the energy companies are 91 pence in the pound for the investment that they're making in the North Sea. That seems to be absolutely outrageous, because it means that they're not actually, from those energy companies, from Shell and BP and so on, they're not actually taking that money at all, because they're giving it straight back to them with the other.
Well, Alec will see that differently. But on the prepayment meters, I mean, they were brought in by Labour, I think, originally, to stop people being cut off if they defaulted on their payments. But now, I think the figures are around 3 million people with prepayment meters being disconnected for not topping up their meters last year. Do you think it should stop in the way Grant Shapps said, people being forced onto them?
Well, I think this is the point, isn't it? Is that I think the original policy, Labour policy, brought in with the best of intentions, and then as time goes by, it gets exploited to the point that they're getting forced. And I think it's right that Grant says, right, wait a minute, Ofgem, we need you to actually start looking at this, because this is going way beyond which I imagine, Barry, your government ever envisioned. And I think when those situations occur, it's right for the Secretary of State to say, well, hang on a minute, can we just address what's going on here? Is it being exploited? And give it to the independent body to take that that look at and see what's going on.
Let's have a look at this headline in the Financial Times. British Volt's collapse drains UK hopes of building battery-making champion. This is the story that this company has gone into administration. It was a UK battery start-up. The majority of its 230 staff have been made redundant with immediate effect. Employees were told yesterday at an all-staff meeting. Should the government have stepped in to back the company and help it survive, Alec?
Well, it couldn't get private investment. And we can put £100 million in and be exactly where we were. But let me throw you a complete curveball. I think it's the wrong approach. I think, first of all, in terms of lithium supplies, we know there's going to be a shortage. We're going to start questioning where they're coming from, and there's going to be a lot of world competition. And we don't do any recycling of these batteries. It's too complex an industry there. But overall, I think we're obsessed with electric cars. We need to be looking at hydrogen combustion cars. So I think that we are running down a corridor, and if we want to put hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money in when private investment can't be found, I do think we should take a step back and think about where the whole agenda is going in vehicle propulsion over the next decade.
Right, so you don't think the government should have stepped in this particular instance for the reasons you've just outlined, but should the government step in to help start-ups in industries that are seen as the future, whether it's the tech industry, whether it is this kind of product, battery manufacturing, because broadly speaking, we're moving towards, or some of us are moving towards having electric cars?
Yeah, but I mean, overall, it's not fair to say the government aren't doing anything. I mean, if you just take support which is there for startups, or indeed research and development tax credits, which are going up 30% on last year as well. So, I mean, there's a whole package of things that move forward. But if you're faced with the situation we were faced there, was it right to put in £100 million of taxpayers' money when you couldn't get private investment?
Barry?
You're going to hear something you don't often hear from me, and that is, I don't know. Because I don't know why it was that Volt actually went into administration. I don't know what were the underlying causes. I don't know why it couldn't get the private sector capital. And I'd really want to look at that in order to be able to make a proper assessment. I think your point in response to Alec was absolutely right. And that is the government should be looking at nascent industries, particularly obviously in the green sector, to support them through to full commercialisation. And the amazing thing to me is that actually we are still supporting with perverse subsidies the fossil fuel industries in this country. As I said, 91 pence in the pound for their investment. I can't understand why we are doing that with public money when we're not supporting in the same way the renewables industries and other nascent industries that we're going to need.
Barry, because
well, every word that I said is entirely true.
But research and development tax credits are available in the same way that they are for the oil industry.
Right, let's have a look. But let me...
just to correct that, that's not actually the case, because actually the 91 pence in the pound is not available for renewables industries. It is available for the fossil fuel industry. So we just need to have the facts right.
It is about choices, of course. Let's just show you this map. You can see battery plants where they've been constructed, I should say, or planned. You can see there are many more of them across Europe. To take Barry's point about a nascent industry, is this something the government should be doing? Alex says that there wasn't the private investment available, or certainly not right up until it went bust yesterday. Should the government cover that?
It looks like it probably should have. I mean, I take Barry and Alex's points that there's a big question mark over why they couldn't raise the private investment. But I think it's entirely possible that private investors didn't want to make that huge upfront cost, because there would be a bit of time before they would see a return on that investment. But the government maybe would be able to wait that out. I mean, when you look at that map, why does Europe think that we're going to need to invest in making loads of car batteries when the UK is so far behind? And in a way, it's a win-win-win for the government here, because so much of the offer in 2019 was levelling up, bringing great jobs and investment to these areas. These are exactly the kind of jobs that people talk about on both sides of the political spectrum. A green industrial revolution on the Labour side. These are the kinds of jobs that people want to see, and then it's paving the way for the energy transition as well.
Jo?
I mean, I agree with Barry. We don't know what's happened. And we actually could be sitting here now saying that company failed and the government had put in the 100 million. And why did they put the 100 million into a company that was perhaps mismanaged, perhaps there were serious... I mean, there's been a lot of reports, a lot of suggestions. I don't know what's true, but there have been allegations about some of the management, what they were doing, where money was spent, how it was spent. So we could be having a very different discussion, which 100 million is a significant amount of money if it had been.
Discussion when, I've forgotten the name of it, the construction company went bust and the government have put billions into that trying to keep it up. I don't want to pretend I know what it is in case I slander another company, but if we remember about 3 or 4 years ago, there was a Carillion, that's it. Government came in for huge criticism saying, why did you keep putting taxpayers' money in when you knew it was going to go bust?
But there is a fundamental question about how you support businesses, what business support looks like and what that planning process looks like, because there are definitely people that have been involved in industrial strategy that are very concerned about sector deals that have happened in the past and now we're seeing the fruits of. They haven't happened. When Greg Clark published the industrial strategy, I remember it being written in the Sunday Times that it was the biggest yawn ever or something. It was kind of... It was actually quite rude about the strategy. But what he was trying to do was absolutely right. And actually, this is probably a product more about short-termism and how we're not looking at...
But isn't that the point?
On so many issues, social care and other things, that we haven't sorted out longer-term problems.
So is this short-sighted? You're always going to take a gamble, aren't you, if you put a lot of money up front for a start-up that perhaps can't find billions?
There's a better gamble. And you've just pointed out 30-odd of these factories being built.
Yes.
No one's recycling them. Nobody's recycling them. And these are rare earth materials that are needed. That's perhaps somewhere we should be looking, that we actually could become the hub of Europe and these cars. Because
but one
at
of
the
the
moment,
questions, Alec, is if you don't have the batteries near where you make the cars, the cost to transport them is so extensive.
But recycling would give you that ability.
It turns people off manufacturing, and that is a problem about long-term manufacturing
and that's the point
decline.
that's made.
But I do think there's an interesting question as to whether that investment would have been given under Boris Johnson or even in Liz Truss's very brief premiership. Because it is, I think, widely acknowledged in Westminster that Rishi Sunak isn't as green as Boris Johnson or Liz Truss, despite what she would have said during the leadership contest. I think that his instincts are a little different on this, and there is this feeling in government right now that they don't have much money to spend.
Or would it be a clever tax thing like they did before with the, we invest, you invest, and then we give you some sort of money back or whatever at the end of it?
It does just seem that Rishi Sunak is less interested in this, and maybe between him and Jeremy Hunt feeling like they don't have much money to spend.
It's caution.
This is not the climate to be investing in.
Do you agree with that? You were a Liz Truss fan at the time. This could have been part of Boris Johnson's green revolution. Do you think it's just a lack of courage and bravery by this government?
No, as I say, I think that we need to be cleverer in what we do, and you are looking, take the Carillion situation where the government did come in for huge criticism for trying to prop that company up. You've got a huge number of these capabilities being built in Europe, as you've shown, but nobody is looking at the industry of recycling, which will be a huge industry. And I think that we can all go down one road and say, chuck the taxpayers' money in. But actually, proper entrepreneurialism and development is to look at where there's a gap in the market.
And I'd just say the Committee on Climate Change has been very clear, and Alex mentioned the hydrogen industry, really important. But the Committee on Climate Change is clear that we need to be investing in all these new technologies.
Yeah, very good point.
Not just picking winners and saying, well, let's not worry about electric batteries, let's focus on hydrogen. We need all of it. If we're to achieve what we need to do to get to net zero within the time frame that we've got, we actually need to be firing on all cylinders.
The second-hand price of electric cars is collapsing, and that's another important factor that's got to come into this.
Let's talk about this rather tragic story. I'm sure you will have all read about it in the Daily Mail. Killed by the dogs she was paid to walk. This is the story about a woman who was mauled to death, a dog walker, after being set upon while out walking 8 dogs in Surrey last Thursday. Let's talk to Anna Webb, dog behaviourist and host of A Dog's Life podcast. Hello to you. Anna, perhaps you can just tell, how did it happen?
Well, no one really knows, which is... the sad truth. All I can say is, everybody is just shocked, feeling so deeply sad for the woman, who was tragically mauled to death. The point is, I really believe, 8 dogs is too many to be walking at any one time in the event an incident occurs. I always say you might be walking 6 dogs, one might slip its collar, make a beeline for a road, get hit by a car. You know, I say, well, what do you do with the other 5 dogs? Currently, there is no regulation for this sector of the industry, and it is a sector that has just grown since the pandemic, when we've seen the dog population rocket in this country. And I think, you know, many people that took on a dog during the pandemic underestimated the commitment that a dog is. People have returned to work. Also, the cost of living crisis is affecting everyone, so maybe they're taking on more work at the expense of their dog to a degree, and using third-party carers for their dog in a way how we do with children. But we must remember, dogs aren't little people. They are dogs. They aren't robots. They're sentient creatures. And I think what happened in this instance was another dog that was off lead, running around out of control in a public space, which is against the law, hassled the dogs, and the dogs got frustrated. They became a bit reactive, overexcited. You know, she had 8 dogs. The leads tangled round her and she was pulled to the ground, and their energy and frustration was misplaced. Now, this is not a normal occurrence. Please let me say that.
No, it's very rare.
Very rare and very tragic.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned regulations around the dog walking industry. What about regulations around dog ownership? I mean, should the government bring back dog licences? Bring back, I should say.
Yes, I absolutely would love the government to bring back the dog licence, you know, and make it quite high, you know, but also make it like they've done in other countries. The Scandinavian countries lead the way here, as does Canada in certain parts, where dog ownership, you become part of a club, you know, and there are benefits of having a dog licence. But also this must be tied in a bit like the driver's licence to a uniform DVLA scheme where you have one central database for all dogs' microchips, which is something that people are campaigning for now, because, you know, there are a number of areas. I must say the Conservative government has been very proactive with dogs over the last few years, and legislation is going through at the moment, hopefully, help, with dog theft, because the central microchip database would help with accountability.
All right.
Help with penalty schemes. For example, if your dog bit somebody or hurt another dog or tripped somebody over, you would get penalty points, a bit like a driving licence scheme.
All right, Anna.
You know?
All right, stay with us and while I bring in the other guests. I mean, Alec, you're a dog owner. Yeah. We've heard there from Anna that the government is in the process of bringing forward some more regulation. Should there be dog licences brought back?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, because if you look at a lot of legislation we've been trying to build in, it's to try and stop puppy farming, sort of some of the illegal activities that take place. So would it have an effect? Maybe, and I think it's definitely worth looking at. I think I looked up my own local authority. In Leeds, a dog walker can have 6 dogs, an individual can have 4 dogs. Maybe the animal behavioural dog expert will probably be able to cast some light on this, but maybe 6 is too many. You've got to understand the dogs. You've got to understand what's going on. I understand my 2 dogs. When I'm out with them, I understand when they're worried, I understand when they're relaxed, I understand when they get scared. I think you've got to understand that. And dog walking industry has exploded, but as far as I could see, the only regulation around it is the local authority saying just what's the maximum you can take. Is there any actual training, perhaps, which could be brought in to say, how do you understand a dog?
Anna, what do you want to say in response?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, I say 100%, absolutely. You know, people think walking a dog is really easy. Well, you know, it's not. And as you say, you know, you do need to know your dog. And the problem is owners aren't spending enough time with their dogs to get to know them or offer them the right social skills. So a dog walker, you know, they're not taken on board to train your dog or teach your dog. They are literally to walk it. But it is a huge responsibility.
Well, I was just going to say to you, Anna, is 6 too many? I mean, if you're talking about numbers for a dog walker.
Absolutely. Well, actually, the most recommended number of dogs in this country at the moment is 4. Where I live, it's 6. In Northamptonshire, the whole county just before Christmas brought in new recommendations to make it standardised as 4 dogs.
All right.
4 dogs. Bit better, but for me, I think it should be 2 dogs.
Are there just too many dogs really owned by people, Jo? Because, I mean, you look at the numbers. As of October last year, 34% of households in the UK own a pet dog. In 2010-11, it was 22% of UK households.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know if it's too many dogs. There is definitely an issue. I've always had a dog. I think I was 6 months old when we got our first dog, and I've still got a Labrador at home now. Sometimes one dog is too many dogs to be walking because if they're a puppy or if they're pretty excitable or they're a bit aggressive, one is plenty to be walking. So what I don't understand in this is that some people paid more than they would pay for a second-hand car for dogs. That's the price that some breeds are now at. And yet they're prepared to let somebody go out and walk their dog and umpteen others at the same time. So there's a lot of questions. It's never a bad dog. It's always the owner. It really is. There are lots of complexities with breeds at the end of the day, but it is always about the owner. And so fundamentally, if you are prepared to let your precious, you might have paid £3,000 for a breed and you're prepared to let someone else look after that one and 4 or 5 others at the same time, I'd be asking...
I'm going to bring the others. We can see Anna's dog, or just about the ears anyway. Barry?
Yeah, look, I think it's not about dog licences. I would like every dog owner to have a certificate that they have taken their dog to puppy training.
Yeah.
And once the training has been done, that certificate, in effect, becomes the licence. Because the problem is not whether you've got a licence or not, it's whether you know how to socialise your dog, whether you know how to train your dog. And unless you've been to that training at the beginning, then it's no good. The licence is not doing anything except giving the government revenue. That's why it was done away with. It was administratively a waste of time. But if it's tied to training of the dog and the owner, because most training is actually of the owner, then it would be a useful function.
Breeds generally.
And microchip them so that then if anything does go wrong, you can check with that dog and that owner actually went to training.
When I went to Battersea Dogs Home to look for a dog, I said I had a disabled person in the house, and they said there were certain breeds that were too protective. If my mum fell and a carer tried to help, they could attack the carer because they wouldn't understand what they were doing. People don't always think about their households and how they live and which breed of dog is appropriate in the first place. So
I know Anna wants to come in. I will come to you, Alva. Anna, you wanted to respond to something Barry was saying, I think.
I was going to say, look, in terms of this DVLA scheme I was mentioning, I think all dog owners need to take a test, get that certificate before they get a dog. So just before you get behind that steering wheel, because I think a lot of people really at the moment don't understand what a dog really is and their needs. And also I would say puppy training, absolutely, but you train a dog through its entire life. Yes. Going to an 8-week puppy training course, that's great, but then the puppy hits adolescence at about 6 months of age and tends to forget everything it's just learned. Yes. So training, like with humans, it's about a life journey and life experiences.
It's a big responsibility, isn't it?
Well, I think the thing I'm just really struck by, we've talked a lot about dog ownership, but we also mentioned that doggy daycares and dog walking, that's a really new booming industry. I know a few people who run doggy daycares, and I know lots of people who use them, people who got dogs during the pandemic and now have to go into the office. And I think that's just this quite unregulated area. I actually think that lots of people who run doggy daycares are fantastic. Even the lovely lady who does our makeup before we come on air was saying that her dog was terribly behaved, and then she got some help from the doggy daycare person and hasn't had any problems. I think lots of people who run doggy daycares are very good with dogs, do understand them very well, have a lot of insight to share. But in the same way that we're having a conversation in politics at the moment around childcare ratios, I just wonder what should the ratios be in that sector? How many dogs per person, not just on dog walks, but in someone's home? Do we risk just decimating that sector if someone can only look after 4 dogs at a time when maybe they're capable of looking after 12 small dogs or something like that?
Anna?
I'd be interested in Anna's view.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Look, in every walk of life, there's better services than others, whether you're an estate agent or a lawyer or whatever. What I would say, circa 2002, I've lived with dogs all my life, I'm 57. My father was high up in the RSPCA, so I learned so much from him on how to behave with dogs and vice versa. All of these third-party care facilities, if you like, are very new. They really didn't begin in this country till 2005. Up until then, you use friends and family to help on the odd day that you might need some help with your dog. This every day taking your dog to a doggy daycare, it can suit some dogs, but other dogs can really get, stressed out, bullied, overwrought, and it not do them much good. And in fact, when you think life is short for a dog and you bring a dog into your life, they are man's best friend. Hopefully you have 15 years with your dog. But, if you don't look after your dog for most of the day, every day, I just have to ask myself this question: why did you get a dog?
Well, and on that note, it's a good point to end. Anna, thank you very much for joining us. And talking of man's best friend, let's just show you this picture, because we did find it, and it is, well, it's rather amusing. There is Alex Shelbrook. I presume it's in Dog of the Year, the parliamentarian Dog of the Year. With your dog, what's he called, or she called?
Oh, well, one's called Boris, one's called Maggie.
Which party do you represent, I wonder, Alec? Barry Head in hands. Well, having shown you that, we're going to move on to the bonfire of EU laws. And do you remember this? So that was a Rishi Sunak leadership campaign video from August of last year. Let's look at today's Express front page. Rishi, bonfire of EU laws will help boost growth. I like the way the will is underlined. The government's going to be challenged in the Commons over plans to scrap thousands of EU-era laws by the end of the year. You will have heard lots of talk about the bonfire of EU laws. Now, critics say the move will give too much power to ministers to get rid of potentially some important workers' rights and environmental protections. Let's have a look at one such law for the bonfire from this story in The Independent a year ago. Jacob Rees-Mogg hails chance to abolish EU restriction on vacuum cleaners as one of top Brexit opportunities. Alec, Jacob authored this bill. He described getting rid of this bit of regulation as one of the most interesting ideas his office had received when they asked for how to capitalise on the UK's newfound Brexit freedom. Is this the best we can look forward to?
I think it's interesting choosing that particular piece, because I think it shows when we talk about EU legislation, you will hear people talk about some really important areas that they don't want to see go, and you also talk about some are, quite frankly, the ridiculous areas, but it's all bunched into one. And what the bill seeks today is to give the government the power within the cabinet to say, right, we're getting rid of these, bringing back these, etc. So I think you talk about EU regulation and you've shown something which seems daft, but there also
I'm not
are
saying
things,
they are. Jacob Rees-Mogg seemed to think it was very important.
Why is that story there? But at the same time, there are some very important aspects of EU law, and I think this is why the government needs the flexibility.
Well, a lot of people think this is important because they wrote in to Jacob Rees-Mogg to say
but they need the flexibility to move quickly on all these laws, which is what I think this bill gives.
Labour, Keir Starmer, has made much of saying we need to make Brexit work, we need to embrace Brexit. So would Labour do the same with this EU retained law, with these thousands of pieces of EU legislation?
Let me make 3 points. The first is that there isn't enough time to seriously go through 2,400 pieces of legislation and, through Parliament, do the necessary renewal of the laws that we want to keep and jettison the others. That's the first thing. The time frame is against us here. The second thing is look at the Natura 2000 and the European Birds and Habitats Directive. These are ones which we probably will not get time before the end of the year to renew into UK law. They were actually written by Boris Johnson's father. We in Europe, when we were in Europe, actually were responsible for creating most of these laws because we wanted them in the UK.
But they're not all going to be junked, are they?
They're not all going to be junked, but they may not be able to be renewed in time, and that's the problem here. The third point that I would make is that we were told that this was an opportunity for us to have better, improved standards. And yet, certainly in the area of employment law, what we have seen is the attack on the right to withdraw one's labour. We've seen the introduction of people being allowed to employ surrogates to come in, agency workers to come in and undermine strikes. We've seen a huge attack on employment law in this country already. So the idea that Brexit was about enabling us to improve the rights that we had at work, that's gone out the window.
Right. I mean, I can see there is an issue about the timing, and there could be mistakes made, genuinely, about important pieces of legislation being either accidentally or deliberately, you know, cast aside. But if Brexit was about anything, it was about some sort of freedom, wasn't it, Jo, to decide about what's worth keeping and what isn't?
Yeah, but it's also, we know, has taken up a huge amount of government lawyers' time, you know, even just getting to the point of getting out and managing the out process has taken a huge amount of time. And going back to my earlier point, the stuff we still haven't dealt with, which have been problems for years, like social care, which we're seeing the effects of not having dealt with those things. So the idea that we divert even more government time, government lawyers' time, there will be, you know, endless political scrutiny of this. The timing issue is really important because you can't do it either A, fully, or B, properly. Right. And then what happens in the interim? And obviously businesses then are going to say, well, hang on, where's the benefit in this? Because the uncertainty is a massive, massive worry. And there are already business groups that are coming out saying that. So it feels like it would have been more sensible to have said we would have looked at certain areas within a certain time frame. But it was a bit cavalier to go, we'll do all of it and do the sort of stunt that they did. As great as it looked, the reality is it was probably never deliverable.
Can I just say the point that you make about business is really critical. And if you look at the REACH directive, that's the chemicals regulations that, again, we were instrumental in getting passed in Europe, the uncertainty for business over the transposition of those into UK law is causing huge problems and huge costs for British business.
I mean, you're listening to the conversation. Are you convinced by this? Should the government just slow down? Should the government just sort of park this, to take the advice of Jo, do it sector by sector over a period of years?
Well, I think there's probably some wise advice in that. But, of course, this is a bill which has got its second reading today. It's got to go to committee stage, reports, then got to go through the Lords. Bills do change. And I think that, you know, we've seen the Prime Minister willing to listen to backbenchers, make changes. Some people called it U-turns, others called it taking in the views of the party.
What do you call it?
I think Alex holding out to that.
That was bravely spoken.
What do you call it?
Very good, thank you.
But it is important that, you know, legislation has a long way to go beyond today.
The end of the year it is.
But the second reading today, that legislation's got a long way to go.
Albert, you want to say something about that, and then I want to point you to the levelling up story. But yeah.
Well, but I think the thing is that, you know, as Alec just diplomatically put it, taking on the views of the party is not just a question of the timing; it's who gets to look at this legislation. And the problem, you're getting backbench Brexiteers who would clearly love to see lots of these laws off the statute books and to change them. People like David Davis saying the problem with this is actually a lot of this scrutiny and decision making will be done on Whitehall by civil servants and ministers, not by Parliament, the MPs who make our laws and should be there to review them. I think that's really the crucial issue. I think it just is the difference between the political campaigning and the reality. I mean, I remember being at Hustings during the Tory leadership contest. Rishi Sunak would get a huge cheer when he announced we'll have all EU laws off the statute books by the end of the year. Huge cheer, and you know, for that mostly Eurosceptic audience. But in reality, even Brexiteers would like a bit more time and a bit more empowerment to look at this themselves.
I've just been told, actually, the bill is further down the line than perhaps you thought. Rather than a second reading, it's third reading and report stage.
Sorry, but I mean, it's got to go into the Lords. It's got to go through a long way. Yeah.
Right, but perhaps slightly less than originally thought.
Some of this stuff was put into place when they could sit for hours. They don't sit as long anymore. So how are they going to get rid of them all in the time they've got available when they're
spend standing orders like we did in the withdrawal agreement?
You know, it's going to be crazy.
Well, that's something to look forward to, isn't it? All weekend looking at EU retained law. Yes, don't say that too loudly. Let's have a look in the Commons, because obviously we're going to Prime Minister's questions in just over 5 minutes' time. You can see their questions continuing as the chamber fills up. I want to draw you to another big campaigning slogan in the Times. Levelling up is so 2019, Alec, apparently. Rishi Sunak's Tories are now gauging up. I had to read this carefully to understand what gauging up... I thought it said gouging up when I first read it. Gauging up or stepping up. I think Lisa and Andy on your side had a slightly different phrase for levelling up. Does it still resonate with your constituents?
Did it ever? I don't know. I mean, the reality is,
you are the Conservative MP
I'm not
for
a member
Rockwell
of
and
the
Elmet.
80-20 group, so the first I knew about this was when I read it in the Times. But look, what I think what always comes down to the fact of the matter is what opportunities are people getting in an area? That's what they look at. And in Westminster, we can call it several things and do several things, but you're judged on your results. And there's a couple of years to go. You've got to have tangible results for people. And if
And
that
so far
doesn't
there
exist,
aren't any?
Well, I disagree with that because, for example,
No,
I've managed
to
achieve infrastructure projects that I've been campaigning for years. You've got the rail upgrade. There's a lot taking place, And when people can see those tangible results, it doesn't matter what it was called, they'll be looking at, has this government done tangible results? That's the important point.
I mean, tangible results, of course, that's what people want to see. It was a powerful slogan, levelling up, though, wasn't it?
It was.
Isn't it? I should say it still is.
Well, it is, because it actually goes to the heart of what people are feeling. They're feeling neglected. They're feeling that they are disempowered. Actually, in many areas, whether it's housing or health or employment, they're feeling very vulnerable. And these are the things that the government needs to address. And, you know, Jo has, I think, 3 times already on this programme talked about the care bill, talked about the need to get something on the statute book that's going to make people's lives better and that's going to enable us to get so many of the other problems sorted out. And that's what really needs to go on. That's the serious business of government. And sloganising is not where it's at. It's delivery for the people who feel so incredibly vulnerable at the moment.
And I think that's an important point, actually, about how it's important what sectors you're focusing on. Jo was talking about earlier on, we're talking about what may be taken up with the EU law. So it's about what you sector on. But, I mean, just in terms of transport, I think there is a lot happening there, and that's one particular sector. And there are other sectors that need to be looked at as well.
Is levelling up not going to survive as a slogan?
Well, I'd love to see what's behind this, because there's got to, in my view, from where I've sat in terms of advising, is it that levelling up has become a dirty word in the focus groups, in polling? Is it not working? Is it that levelling up as a whole is not going to be achieved in the way it was promised in the 2019 manifesto? So let's change it, because then we can't mark it in the same way. The reality is, you know, it was a very powerful slogan. So if you're then going to ditch it, there has to be a significant reason why. And the only thing I can think is that the marking of the homework, when you're looking ahead, because let's face it, we are all now in pre-election. We're looking at 2024. This year is all going to be about leading to that. You start to wonder what's going on behind the scenes. Levelling up is failing as a term and probably as a policy because not enough progress has been made. And you're right, Alec, certain things happening in areas is great, and it's great for you to put on your election leaflet to say this is what the Conservatives delivered. But overall, does that make people feel there has been a sense of levelling up? Potentially not, and that might be what the Conservatives are looking ahead at.
I mean, I remain confused as to whether people understand what levelling up means at all, because sometimes there's polling, especially around 2019, there was polling to indicate lots of people just didn't know what it meant, even though everyone in Westminster uses the phrase a lot, and we talk about that being quite a salient issue. I think then we've had a few years for people to get used to it. There was more polling, I think, today that suggests that that has a bit more cut through. But the one thing I'd be confident of is that it has more cut through than gauging up.
Well, I agree with you on that, I think. As I say, PMQs is coming up in a few minutes' time. We'll, of course, bring you that live and uninterrupted. We'll have Peter Barnes, my colleague from the Political Research Unit at the BBC, watching closely for any claims and counterclaims that are made that might require some further investigation and possibly, I hope, come up with some probing questions for me to put to our politicians after Prime Minister's questions, as despite appearances, I don't come up with all the questions by myself. One of the things we trailed yesterday was Rishi Sunak going on a soapbox tour. Does that fill you with joy, Alva?
Well, I think the rationale here, I don't know if it's joy, Jo, but I think the rationale here is that Rishi Sunak doesn't sound great in scripted long speeches.
Well, I think that's the reason, isn't it?
And he's a bit more authentic when he's answering quite precise questions. I think accountability is great. seeing him up and down the country as a journalist, I think there probably is a bit of joy there. Just seeing him being scrutinised, this is still relatively new Prime Minister, see how he responds to questions up and down the country. I think it's probably not a bad idea, but maybe it might have unintended consequences.
Oh, well, let's hope so. You're nodding away, as was Barry.
Yeah, I agree with Alva, and I think that, I always sort of defend the journalistic trade because I think it is the responsibility of a politician to be able to answer the questions. If they can't, they're in trouble.
Quite right.
So I think getting out and going around and actually reacting to it, I think actually is really valuable when you're able to handle that and you answer the questions and you do what you're doing, because then the public are seeing it in a different aspect. So yeah, I agree with you, and I think it's a very clever move.
I'm all for politicians going out there and getting on their soapbox. I hold gardener's question time in my constituency, obviously, with a name like mine.
We all invite.
And I just think it's really important that we are listening constantly to our constituents.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, then for all the sort of plans you have for legislation in Westminster, if they're not rooted and grounded in people's problems because you've knocked on their doors or somebody's thrown you a wobbly question in the street, then actually they're not going to be the right laws that we pass.
But I mean, the point of this is to boost the headline that we showed yesterday, is to boost the Tories' electoral chances because they've been languishing in the polls, 20 points behind. Is that going to do it?
Well, there's a chance. I mean, I remember working with Boris, and years ago we were the first people to put him onto one of these talk shows. We did it. He was the first one that took questions for a sort of couple of hours. It was the most terrifying period of my life, thinking, I don't know what's coming in. I certainly don't know what he's going to say.
You never knew what Boris was going to say anyway.
It got a bit, but you could predict it a bit more after
He
time,
didn't
Barry,
know.
but it was early days. But it was he even got a marriage proposal. It was random. But the point about that connectivity is really important, and it works for Keir. Keir is very good when he's one-on-one. When you actually talk to him, when you see him, Theresa May was much better in person than when you saw her do TV. She kind of became a bit robotic. A lot of politicians do, and I think that connectivity stuff is good.
I'm sitting on a 17,000, 18,000 majority. I'm out on the doors on Friday, I'm out on the door on Saturday, I'm out on the doors all the time. Why? Because you've got to keep that connection, and you hear what people think.
And on that, to keep the connection, let's go into the chamber. Here, Lindsay Hoyle introducing Prime Minister's questions.
Mr. Prime Minister, Kate Knifton.
Question number one, please, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know members from across the House will be as shocked and appalled as I am about the case of David Carrick. The abuse of power is truly sickening, and our thoughts are with his victims. The police must address the failings in this case, restore public confidence and ensure the safety of women and girls. There will be no place to hide for those who use their position to intimidate those women and girls, or those who have failed to act to reprimand and remove those people unfit from office. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Kate Knifton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As the project champion for the North Midlands Manufacturing Corridor, next week I'm bringing together businesses, leaders and local councillors from across the region in Parliament to set out to Department for Transport officials the importance of the A50, A500 corridor. The Prime Minister understands the importance of investing in our infrastructure and unlocking the potential of our towns and cities. So will he urge government colleagues from Bays and DLUC to attend the meeting and to hear more about the benefits this investment would bring to our region?
Mr. Speaker, the government recognises the strategic importance of the A50, A500 corridor to the Midlands. I know final decisions on this scheme will be made in the third road investment strategy, which is fully published next year, but I know my honourable friend will be contacting ministers in the relevant departments to invite them to hear her case.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join with the Prime Minister in his comments about the dreadful case of Carrick? Mr. Speaker, it's 3 minutes past 12. If somebody phones 999 now because they have chest pains and fear it might be a heart attack, when would the Prime Minister expect an ambulance to arrive?
Mr. Speaker, it's absolutely right that people can rely on the emergency services when they need them, and that's why rapidly implementing measures to improve the delivery of ambulance times and indeed urgent and emergency care. But I'd say to the honourable gentleman, if he cares about ensuring that patients get access to life-saving emergency care when they need it, why won't he support our minimum safety legislation?
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister can deflect all he likes, but for the person suffering from chest pains, the clock started ticking straight away. Every minute counts. That's why the government says an ambulance should be there in 18 minutes. In that case, it would mean just about 12:20. Now, I know he doesn't want to answer the question I asked him, so I'm going to ask him again. When will that ambulance arrive?
Mr. Speaker, because of the extra funding we're putting in to relieve pressure in urgent and emergency care departments, because of the investment we're putting in ambulance call handling, we will improve ambulance times as we are recovering from the pandemic and indeed the pressures of this winter. But I say to the honourable gentleman again, because he makes my case for me, he describes the life-saving care that people desperately need. So why, when in other countries like France, Spain, Italy and others, why is he depriving people here that care?
Mr. Speaker, he obviously doesn't know or doesn't care. I'll tell him. If our heart attack victim had called for an ambulance in Peterborough at 12:03, it wouldn't arrive until 2:10. These are our constituents waiting for ambulances I'm talking about. If it was Northampton, it wouldn't arrive until...
Order. Mr. Blister, I hope you want to see the rest of the questions out, because I want you to be here, but you're going to have to behave better. Come on, Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm talking about our constituents. If they were in Northampton, it wouldn't arrive until 2:20. If they were in Plymouth, it wouldn't arrive until 2:50. That's why someone who fears a heart attack waiting more than 2.5 hours for an ambulance. Not the worst case scenario, just the average wait. So for 1 week, will he stop blaming others, take some responsibility and just admit under his watch the NHS is in crisis, isn't it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I noticed the one place the honourable gentleman didn't mention was Wales, where we know ambulance times are even worse than they are in England, Mr. Speaker. No, and the reason that is the case, because this is not about politics. This is about the fact that the NHS in Scotland, in Wales, in England is dealing with unprecedented challenges, recovering from COVID, dealing with a very virulent and early flu season, and everyone is doing their best to bring those wait times down. But again, I'll ask him, if he believes so much in improving ambulance wait times, why won't he support our minimum safety legislation?
Mr. Speaker, he won't answer any questions and he won't take any responsibility. By 1 o'clock, our heart attack victim is in a bad way. Sweaty, dizzy, chest tightening. This is a heart attack and they're shouting, this is your constituents. By that time, they should be getting treatment. But an hour after they've called 999, they're still lying there, waiting, listening to the clock tick. How does he think they feel knowing an ambulance could be still hours away?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the specific and practical things we are doing to improve ambulance times are clear. We are investing more in urgent and emergency care to create more bed capacity. We're ensuring that the flow of patients through emergency care is faster than it ever has been. We're discharging people at a record rate out of hospitals to ease the constraints that they are facing. And we are reducing the call-out rates by moving people out of ambulance stacks and being dealt with in a community. Now, these are all very practical steps that will make a difference in the short term. But I ask him again and again, and we know why. The reason that he is not putting patients first when it comes to ambulance waiting times is because he is simply in the pockets of his union paymaster.
Mr. Speaker, this isn't hypothetical. This is real life. Stephanie from Plymouth was battling cancer when she collapsed at home. Her mum rang 999, desperate for help. She only lived a couple of miles from the hospital, but they couldn't prioritise her. She was 26 when she died, waiting for that ambulance. A young woman whose life was ended far too soon. And as a dad, I can't even fathom that pain. So, on behalf of Stephanie and her family, will you stop the excuses, stop shifting the blame, stop the political games, and simply tell us when will he sort out these delays and get back to the 18-minute wait?
Mr. Speaker, of course Stephanie's case is a tragedy. Of course, people are working as hard as they can to ensure people get the care they need. But he talks about political games. He is a living example of playing political games when it comes to people's healthcare. I've already mentioned what's been going on in Wales. Is he confident in the Labour-run Wales NHS that nobody is suffering right now? Of course they are, Mr. Speaker, because the NHS everywhere is under pressure. What we should be doing is supporting those doctors and nurses to make the changes that we are doing to bring the care to those people. But I'll ask him this: if he is so concerned about making sure that the Stephanies of the future get the cares they need, why is he denying those families the guarantee of emergency life-saving care?
So that's his answer to Stephanie's family. Deflect, blame others, never take responsibility. Just like last week, he won't say when he's going to deliver the basic minimum service levels people need. Mr. Speaker, over the 40 minutes or so that these sessions tend to last, 700 people will call an ambulance. 2 will be reporting a heart attack. 4 will be reporting a stroke. But instead of the rapid help they need, many will wait and wait and wait. So if he won't answer any questions, will he at least apologise for the lethal chaos under his watch?
Mr. Speaker, he asked about the minimum safety levels. We will deliver them as soon as we can pass them. Why won't he vote for them, first of all? But, Mr. Speaker, we are delivering on the people's priorities. As we've seen this week, the honourable gentleman will just say anything if the politics suits him. It's as simple as that. He will break promises left, right and centre. He promised to nationalise public services. He promised to have a second referendum. He promised to defend the mass migration of the EU. And now we're apparently led to believe that he...
I expect the front bench just to keep a little quiet, because if they don't, there's somewhere else for them to shout their noise.
Mr. Speaker, if we are going to deliver for the British people, people need to have strong convictions. But when it comes to the honourable gentleman, he isn't just for the free movement of people, he's also got the free movement of principles.
Mr. Speaker, on Monday, the independent Net Zero review was published by my honourable friend, the member for Kingswood. Does my right honourable friend join me in welcoming many of those recommendations, and in particular to provide clarity and continuity to all those working to decarbonise our economy, especially those supporting South Shropshire Climate Action Group in my constituency?
Well, Mr. Speaker, can I thank my right honourable friend, the member for Kingswood, for his review, but also pay tribute to my right honourable friend for his work in this area. I'm pleased that the report recognised the UK's leadership in tackling climate change and catalysing a global transformation in how other countries are dealing with it. We have, as the report acknowledged, exceeded expectations to decarbonise, and we're responding to the full range of the review's requests and recommendations in the coming year.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, to promise is a thing, to keep it is another. Well, the Scottish Government kept their manifesto promise to the people, and thanks to support from members of all political parties in Holyrood, the GRR bill was passed. Surely, in that context, the Prime Minister must recognise that it is a dangerous moment for devolution when both he and indeed the Leader of the Opposition seek to overturn a promise made between Scotland's politicians and Scotland's people.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear that the decision in this case is centred on the legislation's consequences for reserved matters, as is laid out in the Scotland Act, which established the Scottish Parliament, which the honourable gentleman talks about, and at the time supported by the SNP. This bill would have a significant adverse effect on UK-wide equalities matters, and so the Scottish Secretary, with regret, has rightly acted.
Mr. Speaker, let me be crystal clear. This is the Conservative Party seeking to stoke a culture war against some of the most marginalised people in society, and Scotland's democracy is simply collateral damage. And on that issue of democracy, let's reflect, because on Monday the UK Government introduced legislation to ban the right to strike against the express wishes of the Scottish Government. On Tuesday, they introduced legislation to overturn the GRR against the express wishes of the Scottish Government. And this evening, they will seek to put in place legislation that rips up thousands of EU protections against the express wishes of the Scottish Government. Are we not now on a slippery slope from devolution to direct rule?
No, Mr. Speaker, of course we're not. This is simply about protecting UK-wide legislation, about ensuring the safety of women and children. This is not about the devolution settlement. I would urge the honourable gentleman and his party to consider engaging with the UK government on this bill, as we did before the legislation passed, so that we can find a constructive way forward in the interest of the people of Scotland and the United Kingdom.
Edward Jensen. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The care, education and support that children receive in their earliest years has the biggest impact on their future life outcomes. And that's why the affordability, accessibility and quality of childcare is so important for families in Eddisbury and right across the country. Yet, despite significant investment by the UK government since 2010, for too many families, the childcare system remains inflexible, complex and expensive. So, can I ask my right honourable friend to restate to this House his commitment to address this essential and pressing issue so that every child can have the best start in life?
Well, I know this is a topic my honourable friend knows very well from his own background, and he's right that it is essential to access quality childcare, which is why we provide every 3- and 4-year-old eligible with at least 15 hours a week of free childcare, and we are considering new plans to improve the cost, choice and affordability of childcare, whether consulting on ratios or indeed supporting more people to become childminders.
Andy.
A Transport Secretary implying NHS workers are deliberately putting people in danger. A Health Secretary pitting dedicated nurses against vulnerable patients. Does the Prime Minister really expect the public to believe that the very people who have dedicated their lives to saving life and limb are so reckless? Or is it not the case that this government have pushed them to their absolute limit and they have no other option but to strike?
Mr. Speaker, we have enormous respect and gratitude for all our public sector workers, especially those in the NHS, which is why we have backed them with not just record funding, but also record investment in more doctors and nurses, 15,000 more doctors, 30,000 more nurses, and more life-saving equipment, which will help them do their jobs, and we continue to want to engage constructively in dialogue with them.
David Simmons.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ruislip, Northern and Pinner has a great many car-dependent, older and disabled constituents, many of whom are horrified to read that the Mayor of London may have manipulated the outcome of his own consultation, in order to impose an unwanted £12.50 daily charge every time they go to a medical appointment or attend hospital. So, does my right honourable friend agree with me that any further rollout of the ULEZ should be paused until these matters have been fully investigated?
Well, my honourable friend has rightly pointed out that transport in London is devolved to the Labour Mayor of London, and it is disappointing that the Mayor, backed by the Leader of the Opposition, is choosing not to listen to the public, expanding the zone against the overwhelming views of residents and businesses. I urge the Mayor to properly reconsider and respond to these serious concerns.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister showed his card this week by ramming through the sacking nurses bill. He has literally gone from clapping nurses to sacking them. His Transport Secretary has said that the bill is unworkable, and the Education Secretary has said that it is not needed. Why does he still want the bill?
Mr. Speaker, it was the Labour Party that showed their cards this week when it came to backing working people. What I'd say to the honourable gentleman, if he really cares about supporting patients, if he really cares about children getting the education they receive, if he really cares about working people being able to go about their lives free from disruption, he should join actually in legislation which is prevalent in many other countries, ensure minimum safety levels in our critical public services, and get off the picket lines himself.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Continuing a theme, evidence is now very clear that the London Mayor's sham consultation has suppressed 5,000 negative responses from members and supporters of Fair Fuel UK, of which I am the APPG chairman. Now, what angers me is this is a tax against my residents in South Thanet. It's a tax against Kent residents. It's a tax against all of the home counties. This is true taxation without representation. And when my right honourable friend assure me he will do all that he can to stop this, because it is a tax that is a fill-up against a failed mayor's budget and a failed mayor.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent and powerful point. The Labour Mayor is imposing this tax on a public which does not want it. He's right to highlight that. Expanding this zone is not something that communities want, and I look forward to working with him to urge the Mayor to properly consider and respond to all these views and stop this unfair tax.
David! Mr. Speaker, during a period of 12 months, 2 of my Caerphilly constituents have lost their lives after being attacked by dangerous dogs. A 10-year-old boy and a senior citizen. Fatalities have also occurred in other parts of the country. It is clear that the Dangerous Dogs Act is woefully inadequate. The government has commissioned studies. It has debated the subject at length, but it has done nothing. My question is, when will the government take action on the issue of dangerous dogs?
Well, the honourable gentleman raises a very important case, and I'm very sorry to hear about the specific families that he mentions, and we recognise that dog attacks can have horrific consequences, and I want to assure him that we take the issue incredibly seriously, and that's why we've established a working group between police, local authorities and other key stakeholders to consider all aspects of tackling irresponsible dog ownership. That working group will make its recommendations later this year, and of course the government will respond promptly.
Karen Bradley.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Staffordshire Moorlands District Council, run by the Conservatives, has an excellent track record of delivering for my constituents whilst keeping council tax low. We have put a bid in to the Levelling Up Fund, and I know that that money would make such an incredible difference to my constituents. So will he use his good office to encourage the Department for Levelling Up to look favourably on us this week?
Well, my right honourable friend has been a stalwart champion for her community, and in particular their Levelling Up Fund bid, which I know will make a massive difference to her community. I wish her and her constituents every success when we announce the next successful round of bidders to that fund.
Sarah Green.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Cheshire and Amersham are struggling to keep up with their energy bills this winter. When they do fall behind, too often families are punished by being switched over to prepayment meters, which are more expensive, which does nothing to help their financial situation. Will the Prime Minister back our call to ban energy companies from forcibly installing prepayment meters and stop energy companies from switching smart meters over to prepayment meters remotely?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to assure the Honourable Lady that Ofgem actually has specific regulations in place regarding the use of prepayment meters and how energy companies should treat those that are struggling with their bills. But what I am pleased to say is that her constituents will receive around £900 at a minimum of support with their energy bills this winter as a result of the actions of this government.
Jacques Leplasty.
Will my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute and thanks to the several thousand people at MOD Defence Equipment and Support at Abbey Wood in my constituency who work tirelessly to ensure that the military equipment and supplies that we have pledged to the people of Ukraine are dispatched quickly and efficiently? And does he agree with me that events in Ukraine are a reminder yet again of the need to invest more in our own sovereign defence manufacturing capability?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, and I'm happy to join him in paying tribute to his constituents at the MOD facility. The work they are doing is making a critical difference in the fight to combat Russian aggression in Ukraine. I know it's extremely appreciated both by the President of Ukraine and his people. And he's right also that it highlights the need for more investment, which is why we're putting £24 billion of investment into our armed forces, but also increasing the amount of kit that we manufacture here at home.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's almost a year to the day since the then Business Secretary, at a visit to the British Royal site in my constituency, promised the company £100 million and proudly boasted to the national media that he couldn't think of a better project that better demonstrated levelling up. Yesterday, the company entered administration, having received not a penny in financial support from the government. Would the Prime Minister agree with me that there's not a single project in the country that better demonstrates the government's lack of industrial strategy, failure of levelling up and abandonment of the North East?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, let me say my thoughts are with the company's employees and families at the time, and we stand ready to support those impacted. Now, let me just outline for the Honourable Gentleman what exactly has happened. We did offer significant support to British Volt through the Automotive Transformation Fund, considerable amount of funding, but entirely reasonably, and it's not something that I expect the Labour Party to understand, that support was conditional on the company receiving private investment as well, which I think is a sensible protection for taxpayers. Unfortunately, that didn't materialise, but I think it's completely wrong to take from that about what else is happening in the North East. Across the North East, there is new investment in the new Envision and Nissan plant, in electric vehicle manufacturing, £1 billion investment in the North East. Just look at what's happening in Teesside or on clean energy. This government is committed to the North East, and it will deliver more jobs and opportunity under this Conservative administration.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has long been a friend to business. As Chancellor, he listened to businesses in Stoke-on-Trent Central about their issues. Stoke-on-Trent has a wide range of manufacturing, fabrication and engineering excellence. Does he agree with me that growing these activities is a vital strand of our levelling up ambitions? And may I invite him to revisit my constituency to meet with them?
Why, my honourable friend is an excellent champion for her constituents, and particularly her advanced manufacturing businesses, which I've had the pleasure of visiting with her in the past. It's important that we support those businesses on energy prices, which we are doing through the announcement the Chancellor recently made, particularly with regard to generous support for energy-intensive industries. And indeed, they can also apply for up to £315 million of capital grant funding to help them make the transition to net zero.
Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I had breast cancer, I had phenomenal nurses. When I had to be rushed to the A&E, the ambulance crew looked after me. Unison, GMB, they're on strike because no one's negotiating with them. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in the Royal College of Nursing history, they have balloted and they are on strike today. I've spoken to the General Secretary of the RCN. She's adamant she wants to end the disputes. She just needs a meeting with the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister show leadership and meet with the RCN? Just a simple yes or no.
Mr. Speaker, at the turn of the year, the government wrote to all unions, including the RCN, to invite them for frank, open, honest, two-way dialogue with relevant Secretaries of State. I'm pleased that those meetings are happening in a range of sectors, and I hope that we can find a constructive way through this.
Speaker, as we approach Holocaust Memorial Day, colleagues can sign the early day motion, they can sign the Book of Commitment, they can attend the various commemorative services. I have to report some very sad news to the House, that the well-known Holocaust survivor, Ziggy Schipper, died at the age of 93 in the early hours of this morning. He was a survivor of Auschwitz, Birkenau and Stutthof concentration camps. He spent his life in this country spreading his message of hope to young people. Will my honourable friend join with me in thanking Ziggy for his life, for his message, which is very vitally important as we sit here today. Do not hate.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very sorry to learn that Ziggy has passed away, and my thoughts are, of course, with his family. I know he was a man with wonderful, wonderful energy and humanity, and I pay tribute to him for his work, and indeed all Holocaust survivors who have so bravely shared their testimonies. We must never forget the Holocaust, and as my honourable friend rightly said, I know the whole House will join me and him in echoing Ziggy's message, which is poignant and accurate. Do not hate.
Graham Stringer.
Will the Prime Minister join his Conservative predecessors in guaranteeing that the HS2 project reaches Manchester, or does he still believe that investment should be taken for poorer areas in the north and given to the more affluent parts of Kent?
Mr. Speaker, this government is investing record sums in transport infrastructure across the country, but especially in the North and Midlands, with a £96 billion integrated rail plan, which will improve journey times east-west across the north and connectivity across the East Midlands. It's a record we're proud of, and now we'll get on with delivering it.
Richard Fuller.
Speaker, there's been a 40% increase in patients on roll with GPs in Biggleswade in the last 15 years, but last week proposals for a Biggleswade Health Hub were not progressed, despite support, financial support from Conservative-controlled Central Bedfordshire Council. So can my right honourable friend advise me what is the status of our manifesto commitment to infrastructure first, and will he and his ministers work with me to bring together the various parts of the NHS to bring the Biggleswade Health Hub back on track?
Well, I'd be very happy to organise a meeting for the honourable gentleman to discuss how to progress his project. He's right about the importance of primary care. There is more investment going in, but we want to make sure it works for his constituency, and I look forward to arranging a meeting with him with the relevant minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is well aware of the injustice of prepayment meters, not recently because he commented on it earlier in a question, because it's long-standing. Higher tariffs and higher social charges. Why then has he allowed a situation where hundreds of thousands have been forced into that penury at a time when winter is upon us and prices are rocketing, and where we face a situation of 8.4 million people facing fuel poverty in April? All he requires to do is to instruct, through himself or through a minister, Ofgem to ensure that there's an equalisation of tariffs between debit and credit, and also that his government takes steps to provide a fund for those who have seen debt arise because of his government's failures. Will he end that manifest injustice of the poor paying most?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think the honourable gentleman's proposal would also increase bills for many millions of families, so I'm not sure it is the right approach. But what we are doing is providing around £900 of specific support with all families' energy bills this winter. There's further targeted support for those who are most vulnerable, which is absolutely the right thing to do. And, as the Chancellor has already announced, we're consulting on what the best thing to do going forward, including options, as he mentioned, such as a social tariff, as part of our wider reforms to the retail energy market.
Laura Farris.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Every single country in the G7 requires some level of minimum service to be provided when strikes take place in essential public services, often with laws that actually go much further than that. Does my right honourable friend agree that the British people should be entitled to the same basic level of protection when strikes take place in these services? And does he think the former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair had a point when he said last year the big defect at the birth of the Labour Party was its tie to organised labour?
Well, Mr. Speaker, My honourable friend put it very well, but she's right to make the point that what we're proposing is in line with the vast majority of other countries around the world. Indeed, many countries ban strikes in blue light services altogether. We are not doing that. We are joining countries across continental Europe and having minimum safety laws, which I think reasonably the public would expect to have a level of emergency life-saving care in the event of strikes. I think that's a common sense, reasonable position to take, and we all know why the party opposite can't bring themselves to support it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This month, the Right Honourable Member for Stratford-upon-Avon was forced to pay millions to HMRC to settle a tax dispute. Was the Prime Minister aware of the investigation when he appointed him to his Cabinet and as Chairman of the Conservative Party? Will the Prime Minister demand accountability from his Cabinet members about their tax affairs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend has already addressed this matter in full, and that's nothing more that I can add.
Speaker, if I may, I would like to begin by putting on record this House's heartbreak at the tragic death this morning of our friend Dennis, the Minister of Interior Affairs in Ukraine, and his deputy, and all those who were killed in that tragic accident. I'm sure this House is united in our feeling on that. Turning to more local affairs, as many have pointed out, the government, I understand, is in the final furlongs of giving out its levelling up bids, and I must ask him to look kindly upon building the borough market of the Midlands and building a future Meditech hub in Rutland. So can he assure me that not just urban, but also rural areas will be levelled up?
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me join with my honourable friend in paying tribute to the family of the Interior Minister in Ukraine. I know our thoughts will be with him at this difficult time. And also I can confirm to her that this government believes levelling up should apply equally everywhere across our United Kingdom. Urban and rural communities up and down the country will get the benefit of having the investment that they deserve, making sure that we can spread opportunity and ensure everyone has pride in the place that they call home.
Mr. Speaker. David Cameron said the Scottish Parliament was one of the most powerful devolved parliaments in the world. Yet the Prime Minister continues to block the Scottish Parliament's clear mandate to allow Scots to choose their own future. And on Monday he sent his MPs through the lobbies to deny Scottish workers the right to strike despite overwhelming Scottish Parliament opposition. And on Tuesday he sent his Secretary of State for Scotland to block an act of the Scottish Parliament voted for by 70% of MSPs, including Tories. Does he still think that David Cameron's ridiculous assertion holds any water whatsoever?
Well, Mr. Speaker, there have been 347 acts passed by the Scottish Parliament, which is undeniably one of the most powerful devolved legislatures anywhere in the world. In this exceptional case, it's clear that the Act does have adverse consequences for UK-wide equalities legislation. So in those very exceptional circumstances, the Scottish Secretary has regretfully taken the decision to block passage of the legislation. But as I said previously, we want to engage in a dialogue with the Scottish Government to ensure that we can find a constructive way through.
The British people rightly expect us to be able to control our borders, so I was very pleased that the Prime Minister made one of his 5 priorities the need to stop the boats in the Channel. Can he reassure me and my constituents in Newcastle-under-Lyme that not only will we bolster the patrols on the French beaches, but we will make sure that people who do make that dangerous journey and arrive are removed?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is right that this is a priority for all our constituents. He's right to highlight the new deal that we have with France, which increases funded patrols on French beaches by 40%. And as he said, we must go further to solve this problem once and for all. And that means introducing new legislation that makes it unequivocally clear that if you enter the UK illegally, you should not be able to stay here, but instead will be swiftly detained and removed.
We're going to leave Prime Minister's questions at this point and bring you any developments if they are particularly important. Let me welcome our guest for this part of Politics Live, Lucy Fraser for the Government, Housing Minister in the Department of Levelling Up, Lucy Powell, the Shadow Culture Secretary for Labour, and the BBC's Chief Political Correspondent, Nick Eardley. Welcome to all of you. It was a pretty angry, actually, set of exchanges there between Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, and Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister. Keir Starmer setting out in quite a sort of chilling way, if you like, using timings to say that ambulance waiting times have increased to the extent that somebody suffering a heart attack might not get picked up by an ambulance and taken to a hospital and given life-saving care across the country because of ongoing strikes. He called on the Prime Minister to take responsibility, be accountable. He didn't offer a particular solution himself. The response from Rishi Sunak, equally testy by the end, was to say, well, you're making this party political. What about the situation in Wales, where there is a Labour government? And why don't you support our minimum service legislation? Are we getting anywhere with the strikes here?
No, I don't think we got very far with that, because they were almost talking about different things, weren't they? And you saw the crux of the attack lines. You know, Labour clearly think that these examples are damaging for the government. That we've got to a point where the NHS is in such trouble that there are tangible examples for a lot of people of things not working. And at the same time, we've seen it said time and time again by the Prime Minister, haven't we? That reference back to the union barons and Labour being in hock to them, it feels quite repetitive at the moment. It felt quite similar to last week's Prime Minister's questions in some ways, but the two aren't really engaging with each other on the substance of those points, more the politics of it.
Yeah, they're talking past each other. I mean, we've talked about the ambulance waiting times. That was the specific question that Keir Starmer put to the Prime Minister. Peter Barnes, I said, from the BBC's Political Research Unit, was watching those exchanges and has been looking at ambulance waiting times in England compared to ambulance waiting times in Wales, where there is a Labour government as opposed to the UK Conservative-wide government.
Yeah, Joe, it's actually very tricky, really, to compare the two nations because they do collect stats in slightly different ways. They have different categories of ambulance call-outs. In England, we have what are called C1, C2, C3, C4. So C1 are the most severe cases, whereas in Wales it's red, amber and green, so they just have 3 categories there. I've been looking into the stats. Keir Starmer was really mostly talking about the second category, so people who might be suffering from a heart attack, and he gave instances of particular parts of the country where the waits are particularly bad. But the latest stats we have for England are pretty terrible across the whole country. For that category of call-out, the average waiting time in December was over an hour and a half. So some of the places are worse than that and some of the places are better, but the average was 1 hour and 32 minutes. Now, we don't have comparable figures for December in Wales yet. They will at some point come out. But in general, Wales is only looking at its targets are primarily about its most acute cases. So that's the red cases in Wales, which I suppose would most closely be aligned to the C1 cases, the most acute cases in England. And there we can just about draw a comparison. The most recent month I've been able to find comparable data for is October last year, where in Wales the mean average for a red call-out was just over 10 minutes, and 10 minutes and 2 seconds to be precise. And in England it was just under 10 minutes, 9 minutes and 56 seconds. So Rishi Sunak's claim that it's worse in Wales, if that's the sort of thing he's thinking about, I'm not sure. It is slightly worse, but it's very, very close. And the truth is ambulance waiting times are very bad in both countries, both in England and in Wales. And so for questions, I think for your panellists, for Lucy Fraser, it's when is this going to get better and what are the causes of the problem? It's not just the strikes. These are the averages on non-strike days. This isn't caused by the strikes. And for Lucy Powell, why is it just as bad in Wales? Does having a Labour government not make any difference?
Peter, thank you very much. Lucy Fraser, let's start with you. When is it going to get better? And it is absolutely true that this is really an accumulation. It's not just down to the strikes.
Well, we know it's very challenging in the NHS, and we know that they have seen COVID. They've seen, additional people going in because of flu. But
this also predates COVID, doesn't it?
But the flu started in November, so we have had increased pressures, not just in the UK, but across the world. That's why the Prime Minister has put in an extra £14 billion over the next 2 years for exactly this, to cut backlogs and for emergency care. So speeding up discharges from hospital, an extra 7,000 beds. But it is important to take into account the point about minimum safety levels, because the strikes do add to this burden. And I've been in meetings where we've been discussing, do we know the day before how many ambulance services are going to operate on the next day, in the strike day? So this is adding significant pressure to an already challenging time.
Is that the government's only solution to resolving these strikes? You want to point to strikes. You say they're exacerbating the situation in terms of backlogs and waiting times. People might point to underinvestment, the rate of increase of money going into the health service since 2010. It has slowed. But is that the only thing that the government wants to talk about, is minimum service legislation to sort out this huge problem?
Absolutely not.
But it's all Rishi Sunak talks about.
Well, he's challenging the Labour leader on it because I think it's an important question. But you talked about funding. We have record investment into the NHS, £165 billion for 2024-25. That's much more significant than over the last few years, even when we've been putting more and more year on year into the NHS.
All right. Well, why isn't it better in Wales, Lucy? We heard Peter Barnes setting it out there. There may not be direct comparisons, but it isn't any better.
Well, I don't think they are direct comparisons, but I'm not a Welsh politician. I'm not here to answer for those questions. But obviously, the NHS budget in Wales is set by Westminster. Judge Labour, by its record when we were in charge of the UK government, waiting times...
record levels of investment. If you think it's about money...
Waiting times in England, Scotland and Wales were record lows ever when we last left government. So these are structural problems because it's not just about putting in the money at this last minute here. The reason why we have such long waiting times for ambulances is a symptom of so many things that are wrong in our NHS, particularly around care in the community, discharge and so on to care homes, because at any one time in a hospital, there are dozens and dozens, if not hundreds and hundreds of patients who are ready for discharge but have nowhere to go. So that backs up throughout the hospital.
We understand.
My husband's an A&E doctor, so he's working incredibly hard at the moment trying to deal with this huge demand in workload. Ambulances are stuck outside A&E because they can't come into A&E because people can't get out of A&E to get into a hospital because they can't get out of a hospital because they can't get to social care. So we might have record investment in the NHS, but we obviously have a massively bigger population and an ageing population, but we've seen huge cuts in social care.
Right, what's the resolution? Because that's what I didn't hear from Keir Starmer. You have equally compellingly set out the problems, the issues and the concerns, but what's the resolution? Why won't you at least support the minimum service legislation? At least that would guarantee a skeleton service.
But there is
that would actually guarantee for patients countrywide, not just individual contracts. Why won't you do that?
Because there is a minimum service level agreement. As I say, my husband's an A&E doctor. Nurses in A&E would never go on strike. They don't go on strike. Ambulances do the Category 1 call-outs and they go to the Category 2 call-outs where they can. There is already clearly minimum service. This is a total straw man from the government, trying to suggest that it is striking ambulance staff or striking nurses that are the problems in our health service. The problems in our health service is why they're on strike, because it's not just about pay. Ambulance workers are fuming because they used to be able to do in an hour, they used to do 3-4 call-outs in an hour. Now they're doing 3 or 4 call-outs in an entire shift because they are really unhappy at the way that the NHS is being run by this government as well as pay.
Nick?
So with Category 1 calls in England, you're right, there is a minimum service, but with Category 2 there's not. And the problem that the government keeps coming back, is there are local individual agreements with local union bodies rather than nationally. So do you think that's a problem, or do you think there is an argument that there should need to be an England-wide agreement on those?
Well, what I certainly don't think is that the way to solve that problem, if that is a problem, and I'm not sure that it really is a problem, I think it's one that the government is trying to set up as a straw man, is to say the way we have to deal with that is have the threat of sacking you for not having that arrangement.
Right, well, answer that question.
Which is the most ludicrous thing I've ever heard.
Answer that question, which comes back to, is that the only thing you've got to offer here to resolve this?
Well,
the threat of sacking.
Because it is really important that we do know at a regional level what is happening in each area so that we can prepare for it. And I can tell you that in relation to the ambulance strikes, we didn't know until the very last minute. So those arrangements are made, but at a regional level. And if we are going to run proper services,
but you're not running proper services
in these periods, then we do need to have that minimum level. Now, the government doesn't want to get to that point. It wants to get to a point whereby, you know, the unions do provide a minimum service level. We're taking a power to do this through the legislation. And we are also talking, so it's not just about pay. Lucy is right. We also recognise that there are issues across the NHS, across services, about workload as well, about conditions.
Yeah. But until there are more staff, until there are more doctors and nurses and general NHS staff, that will continue, that workload, unless, of course, there is reform. But just briefly, because I want to move on from both of you, would a substantial pay rise, let's say, to ambulance drivers, would that resolve it?
Well, I don't know. I'm not an ambulance driver. It's not my job to negotiate for the ambulance driver.
But do you think it would, in principle, resolve it?
Well, obviously, they've got some asks on pay. Right. They've got some asks on terms and conditions.
And you'd agree to that?
And that's, well, you know, you have a negotiation. That's how it works. The government needs to negotiate. But on this point of minimum standards, on non-strike days in December, 1 in 10 people waited over 3 hours for a Category 2 ambulance. There are no minimum standards. The idea that there are minimum standards on non-strike days is a joke. It's a bit of a straw man.
Should this year's settlement be reopened? There doesn't seem to be any way through these strikes unless the government finally accepts that you've got to look at the 22-23 pay.
So we have independent pay review bodies who have set...
But, Lucy, we know, we've heard this repeatedly. Sorry to sound so weary about it, but I think our viewers now know that governments guide. They can overrule recommendations. These strikes are ongoing. People watching will say, do what you must do to stop them. I recognise the point you're making, but just to come back, there are independent pay review bodies who do take into account evidence that the government puts forward, and the government does say what it can afford because that's its evidence. Right. But it also takes account of evidence that put forward by the trade unions, what market levels are, how do we retain staff, and pay review bodies have in the past, and I know this because I was a minister that gave evidence to a pay review body, do on occasion recommend a pay in excess of what the government has recommended. Like the private sector wages have grown by 7.2% annually in the 3 months to November. Is that fair that public sector workers are getting half the rise that private sector workers are getting? If you left it to the market, that's what they'd come up with.
Well, I'm not quite sure about those figures. So, for example...
They're ONS figures.
Well, first of all, the figures don't often take into account pension. So a lot of public sector employees get, so nurses, for example, may get an additional 20% by way of pension. And actually the ONS data figures...
All right, but in terms of pay?
But for the ONS figures for April in 2022 showed actually the median salary in the public sector was higher than that in the private sector.
Well, I think the most recent figures have said there is a much wider gap than there has been in recent time when it comes to pay. At the moment, the negotiations aren't looking at the settlement for this year, which is very much certainly what the Nurses Union would like and others. And now we know teachers are going to be on strike for the same reason, because of stagnant wages for about 12 years. Again, unless that is open, is there no way through?
I think people have got a right to be confused over this, because I'm a bit confused. We had the meeting between the health service unions and the health secretary last Monday. Everyone came out, sounded a bit more optimistic. There was talk of a one-off payment or backdating next year's pay deal so the people got a bit extra cash. But whenever I speak to people in number 10 or the Treasury, they just say, there's actually nothing concrete being discussed at all. The unions say that since that meeting, nothing formal or informal has been discussed. So, Lucy, I don't know if you can help us. Is anything else on the table at all? Or is this just positive noises?
Well, I'm not in the Department of Health, but I do know that the Secretary of State has talked to the unions, and I do know he is interested in discussing, having talks about pay in future years, as well as conditions and workforce. But you'll have to talk to him about what he specifically said about previous years.
You are a levelling up minister.
I am.
Is it still the case in your mind that the Treasury is just saying no? to everything in terms of what the unions are asking for and what Steve Barclay, the Health Secretary, is trying to get?
So in Levelling Up, I'm the Housing Minister.
Yes.
I can tell you there's a lot of money going into housing. We made an announcement this morning, £60 million going into regeneration. And over the next few days, you'll see a Levelling Up announcement.
And is it still called Levelling Up, by the way?
It is still called Levelling Up. You saw the Prime Minister say that a couple of times on PMQs.
So this headline...
a £2.1 billion Levelling Up fund to regenerate areas across the country.
So this headline's wrong. We did it just before PMQs. Levelling Up is so 2019, Lucy. You're very 2019. It says Rishi Sunak's Tories are now gauging up.
Yes, I don't recognise that. But I think whatever you call it, the important thing is about what are we delivering.
Well.
And what we're delivering is greater devolution, so more powers to people. In the north, 65% of people are now got a metro mayor, so greater powers transferred from Westminster to areas, including in the north. We've seen pay rise outside London and the south east, faster in the regions than in London. And as I mentioned, the Levelling Up fund, we'll see regeneration of towns and cities.
All right. Well, let me ask you about something less comfortable, which is the BBC News headline, Nadeem Zahawi, the Tory party chairman, also a former Chancellor, briefly, facing questions about tax payment. Nick, just fill us in on this story, which is about allegations of unpaid tax that Nadeem Zahawi, millions of pounds of unpaid tax that Nadeem Zahawi has now, according to the Prime Minister today, has said that the matter has already been addressed.
Answered in full, I think, was the phrase that the Prime Minister used, which I'm not sure is one that I would recognise, because we have asked quite a lot of questions about this. The Sun on Sunday had a report on at the weekend saying that the former Chancellor had paid a seven-figure sum, so somewhere over £1 million, to settle a tax dispute with HMRC. We have asked Nadeem Zahawi and his team quite a lot about this. We haven't had an answer on whether that was paid. His team have said that his tax fares are up to date, paid in the UK. He'll answer any questions he gets from HMRC, but it's not clear from the answers that his team are giving whether there was a tax dispute, whether Nadeem Zahawi has paid a bunch of money to settle it.
Should we have answers to these questions, Lucy?
I think if you've got questions, you need to put them to Nadeem Zahawi.
We did.
I don't know any more than Nick has said. Those are the things that he has said.
Right, but in terms of transparency, what were the three words that Rishi Sunak said this government would represent? Accountability, professionalism and integrity? You may correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those were the three. Is that in the spirit of that mantra for this government, with questions around a former Chancellor in terms of his tax affairs?
Well, I think, as Nick said, he said his tax affairs are up to date and he's happy to answer any questions that HMRC put to him or...
Oh, well, I mean, would you recommend that Nadeem Zahawi perhaps comes on a programme like this to answer these questions himself, bearing in mind he is a senior politician in the government? Those questions are going to continue and they'll continue in studios like this.
Well, I think that's a question you have to ask Nadeem.
Right. I mean, does that satisfy you, Lucy? Because we also had a Conservative MP on yesterday saying, look, if it's been addressed, then we shouldn't be nosing into the private affairs of every MP. You'd agree with that?
Well, look, I think it's a question of judgment here, isn't it, of the Prime Minister, actually, because he's the guy who appoints these people. You're not telling me that the former Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, didn't know personally that there were outstanding issues relating to the tax affairs, the multi-million-pound tax affairs of a member of the Cabinet at the time when he was Chancellor, yet he then went on to appoint that same person to his Cabinet. And it's not just Nadine, is it? It's also, we've got Dominic Raab being appointed as the Deputy Prime Minister when the Prime Minister knows that there are several allegations that are under investigation around bullying and harassment in that department.
It was.
And I think there are suggestions that he knew before, but he's certainly not dealt with it. He's not dealt with it.
Well, we have had a response from Mr. Zahawi's spokesman, who said that his taxes are properly declared and that he has never had to instruct any lawyers to deal with HMRC on his behalf. As he has previously stated, Mr. Zahawi's taxes are properly declared and paid in the UK, the spokesman said.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I think as we've got millions of people around the country frantically doing their own tax returns this month. You know, the idea that you can sort of dip in somewhere and pay several £million of tax, I don't know. But as I say, I think this is these are not really, in that sense, questions for Nadine Zahawi. They are questions for the Prime Minister's
Well, and he
own
was
judgment.
asked about it. Just before we go, Nick, the SNP leader in Westminster understandably raised the issue of the conflict, now the constitutional conflict between the UK government and the Scottish government over the gender recognition certificates. It looks as if it's going to end in the courts, this, doesn't it?
I think there'll be an attempt to judicial review it from the Scottish Government, which will look at whether the UK Government followed its own kind of rules for making these decisions. So, yes, I mean, this is going to roll on and on and on, both in terms of the politics of gender and the politics of how that decision was made.
Yes or no? Is the government doing the right thing with the Section 35?
Well, all we've seen is this set of reasons, not actual legal advice.
Yes or no?
It feels like a nuclear option for quite a small, area of disagreement. But the two should have got round the table and resolved it before now.
Well, we're round a table now, but from all of us here, bye-bye.